Our first speaker today is Loretta J. Ross, and she's presenting our keynote on reproductive justice and human rights. She's an award-winning, nationally recognized expert on racism and racial justice, women's rights, and human rights. Her work emphasizes the intersectionality of social justice issues and how intersectionality can fuel transformation. Ross is faculty at Smith College in the Program for the Study of Women and Gender. She's co-written 3 books on reproductive justice and has another one coming this year. She was a co-founder of and the national coordinator from 2005 through 2012 of the Sister Song Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective. So please join me in welcoming our distinguished keynote speaker, Loretta J. Ross.
Thank you, and it's such an honor to be here. I hope everyone can hear me clearly. All right. I did not become an intentional feminist. I am probably representative of many patients that you see in your practice because I became pregnant at 14 and it was through incest. And because that was 1968, I did not have a choice. I didn't have access to contraception. I didn't have access to abortion, nor was I protected from a cousin who thought it was a good idea to get me drunk to have sex with me. So I stand at those intersections of vulnerabilities, not having the right information to protect myself, not having effective options once I became pregnant. And so I had my son, born in 1969, and because I made the decision to keep him, I ended up co-parenting with my rapist. And so my life is a lived example of the theories that a lot of people try to talk about. Well, why don't you just have the baby? Why don't you just give him up for adoption? Why don't you? Why don't you? Why don't you? But I became a feminist because those are my lived experiences. And I can speak to how hard it is to not have choices, to struggle to parent a child that you love and hate his circumstances, how he got here, how complicated it is when people don't have the choices to self-determine what happens in their lives. And so that led me on the path to feminism. And I think I can speak with an authentic voice that says that it shouldn't be harder for young people today to face unpalatable choices than it was for me in the 1960s. We should be making it easier, not more difficult. And so that's what provides me the perspective that I'm going to be offering today. I've been in the movement for more than 50 years, so I've seen a lot of changes. But my biggest disappointment is that we're still fighting for the same thing. That I really thought that when I came into this movement as a teenager, I'd be, laying on a beach having a ball, not continuing to fight for reproductive justice. But, the world is the way it is, and we have no choice. In many ways, this is our lunch counter moment. This is the time when we get to stand up against injustice, when we get to say, okay, all the good stuff didn't happen before we were born. Now is our time to make sure that we're on the front line, to make sure that people have a full range of options, that they don't suffer, that we keep them centered in our lens, and that they can be self-determining about their future and their destiny. And one coda I want to add to my story was because I was a teen mother, I didn't graduate college until I was 55 years old, because my son graduated before I had the opportunity to go back to school and finish my degree. So no one is more surprised than me that I'm a tenured professor at Smith College, because for 55, well, actually 62 years, that was not in the forecast of what my life would turn out to be. So the other thing I'll say before I get to my presentation is that as you support people making their contraceptive choices, also support them in not giving up on their dreams. Because you never know how that story is going to end, and what opportunities and challenges they'll face later on. But if you're that voice who reinforces that their dreams are possible, you may help them not give up on themselves when the world says they may not feel deserving, they may not feel worthy, they may not feel capable. So you never know what an intervention will produce in somebody's life. So I just wanted to share that personal story with you before I get into the academic professorial road and start talking. And you're like, oh, what? Why is she saying these things? Kind of thing. My moniker, my nickname is Dread Feminist because I looked at the women's symbol a few years ago and wondered why nobody dreaded it up. I started growing my dreadlocks in 1980, so I decided that I was going to embrace the concept of a dread feminist. And the dread is named after Dred Scott, if you don't remember that Supreme Court decision in 1857, where the Supreme Court ruled that Black people were not citizens, were to be considered 3/5 of a human being. So I always want to bring that into our conversation. As I said, my presentation will be around reproductive justice and human rights. I am an associate professor at Smith College right up the road, and I have the experience of being one of the 16 co-founders of the Sister Song Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective. I strongly encourage you to partner with them if you're not doing so already, and call on them for resources and assistance because they're a broad coalition of women of color who work on reproductive health rights and justice issues and stand prepared to provide cultural competency services and all kinds of legislative policy and organizing assistance for reaching women of color. I want to start by talking about why are we in this fight in the first place. I'm sure many of you have already seen the headlines that by the middle of this century, white people are going to be a minority in this country, amongst other minorities. It'll be the largest minority, but still, white people will no longer be 50% of the population. The alarmists have put together a film called Demographic Winter, which I advise you to watch because it's a very carefully crafted film that talks about this white panic at becoming a minority within the US and globally. And it's very interesting how they put together that film without ever mentioning the concept of race or gender. But if you read between the lines, it's always about that white panic of what happens when one is not the dominant race within a country, and that the country has to embrace a democracy and pluralism, which doesn't feel good to a number of people who are alarmists. The other issue, let's see if I can make this PowerPoint work, is that we have to deal with climate change. Climate change is putting a lot of pressure on the global situation. It's predicted that there'll be at least 200 million global refugees because of climate change, both externally and within our own countries, as people are dealing with rising sea levels and tornadoes and hurricanes and wildfires and things that we have not successfully planned to anticipate. And it's pretty clear that many of our forms of governance simply are inadequate to address the way that our borders are so porous when it comes to pandemics. Businesses go where they want to go to, money goes where it wants to. The only thing locked down behind borders successfully, and that's even not so well done, are people. But crime, environmental problems, migration, all of these things are happening. And this takes place in a larger context because we do have a growing movement in this country of white nationalists, which I prefer to call white supremacists, who are, because of their panic, are going to demand an upgraded form of imperialism. going in and messing with other governments and conquering them. And I think we're going to end up with an attempt to impose an apartheid-like system on our society where a shrinking minority tries to permanently control the destiny and opportunities of the majority. I should pause here and make very clear that I'm critiquing white supremacy as an ideology, not whiteness as an identity. An ideology is a body of ideas that one subscribes to. And anyone can be a white supremacist because not all white supremacists are white. And obviously, not all white people are white supremacists. So before you think that I don't make that distinction, I wanted to make that very clear. I also believe that many of the restrictions that we presently see and will see more of in the future are based on this white panic, demographic panic of people who think they're demographically doomed. And so I believe that we're dealing with attempts to manipulate the fertility of white women because I've seen no evidence that the people, like in the Texas legislature and in my home state of Georgia, or all throughout the South, Mississippi will probably be the next state. I don't see any evidence that they want more brown and black babies. I only see evidence that they have failed to convince white women to have what they believe is sufficient number of babies. And if you look at the teen pregnancy statistics, every demographic has reduced its teen pregnancy rate since the 1970s. It's been steadily declining, except for one. Highly religious white teenagers are actually having an increase in teen pregnancy rates. And so their plan is working because it is manipulating the fertility of ill-educated white women who live in communities that don't have access to sufficient contraceptive and abortion services. And then these global pressures mean that we will see increasing justifications for both internal and external wars as countries fight over natural resources. And in fact, we're already dealing with the maldistribution of resources where some people, even in this country, lack access to adequate clean water. If you can remember the situation in Flint, Michigan, but Flint was just the tip of the iceberg. Clean water, non-toxic land, available housing, all of these things are going to be affected by the reproductive decision making of people. And sadly, I'm afraid that our scientific and technological developments will actually upgrade these kinds of inequalities. And the governments cannot cope with this. As a matter of fact, they're having trouble just reining in Facebook and Twitter and Google right now. And so they're going to have to reconfigure what they do. And of course, this is going to affect corporations and nonprofit operations as well. So in 1994, I was lucky enough to be one of 12 Black women who were attending a conference in Chicago hosted by the Illinois Pro-Choice Alliance. And at that conference, if you can recall back to those days, President Clinton was in office and his wife, Hillary Clinton, was attempting to do healthcare reform. And for some reason, they thought that if they omitted or downplayed reproductive health care and healthcare reform, that they could somehow lessen the opposition of the Republican opponents to their plan. And so, as one of the 12 Black women at this conference, we were alarmed by this bait and switch approach. First of all, I don't think the opponents of healthcare reform were fooled at all. They were opposed to healthcare reform regardless of whether it included reproductive health care. But the larger question that we asked ourselves is, why would the administration come to a feminist conference with a healthcare plan proposal that omits reproductive health care when reproductive health care is the main driver of women to a doctor? I mean, your first on becoming a woman moment is your feet up in those stirrups. And so, what was the logic of saying you can come to a feminist conference with a male centered healthcare plan and then expect women to endorse it? So, we met in one of our members' hotel rooms that night, and we started problematizing the situation as we saw it. First of all, we saw that abortion was almost inevitably disassociated from reproductive health care, isolated, when in fact, when a person encounters an unplanned and unintended pregnancy, before they decide whether or not to keep that pregnancy going, they're considering whether or not they can keep a job if they are pregnant, whether or not they have a bedroom to put that child in, whether or not they may experience violence from their partner if they tell them, whether they can continue school, whether they live in a safe enough neighborhood. All of these are human rights issues that are way upstream of the decision whether or not to continue an unintended pregnancy. And so the isolation of abortion from all of those human rights and social justice issues never made sense to us. And so we spliced together the concept of reproductive rights and social justice to create the concept of reproductive justice that I'll be explaining. We do have to recognize that because we were Black women, though, we led with the human right to have the children that we want to have, because Black women and other vulnerable women, particularly Latinos and Native Americans, are consistently subjected to various strategies of population control under the eugenical belief that we have too many children and we're the reason our fertility is the reason for so many social problems. This is not true, but this is the logic where dangerous contraceptives are often promoted on us, sterilizations are overused, misdiagnosis of reproductive health conditions can take place, etc. So our first tenet became the human right to have a child. And not only to have that child, but to have that child under the circumstances according to the birth plans that we choose. So that includes using a doula or a midwife or other traditional practices that come from our cultures and our lived experiences. But we also overlap with what's called the pro-choice movement to fight not to have a child, and that's to use contraceptives, abortions, or abstinence if you can hold on. Some people rumor that it works. I'm not so sure it does, but anyway. And so we shared that agenda with what's called the pro-choice movement. And if you're using the term pro-choice, that's a perfectly fine term to use. We are not trying to rebrand everybody with the reproductive justice brand. Matter of fact, I'll be talking later in the presentation about why we prefer you not to use the term reproductive justice if you don't use the criteria that are attached to the term reproductive justice. And then the third tenet that we created in 1994 is probably the most capacious, because we believe that every human being has the right to parent their children in safe and healthy environments. And this brings us into conversation about environmental problems or gun control or school safety or the school to prison pipeline or adequate housing or safe communities and adequate transportation. So with that third tenet, we're talking about both biological and non-biological impacts on people's reproductive health rights and justice decisions. About 10 years after we created those three core tenets in 1994, a newer generation of reproductive justice activists started demanding a fourth tenet. And that's because they felt that the first three tenets were too womb-centric and not inclusive enough of people, human rights, who were not necessarily focused on reproduction. And so they wrote that individuals have the human right to disassociate sex from reproduction, and healthy sexuality and pleasure are essential components to whole and full human rights. And so that was the expansion of the reproductive justice framework to include trans people, LGBT people, people who are choosing not to have children, whether voluntarily or involuntarily, and etc. And so as it presently stands, the reproductive justice framework has those four components. It is very possible and probably probable that it will be expanded again in the future. For those of you in the reproductive health field, you may be wondering, well, how does this all connect to what I'm working on? We call it the reproductive justice model. The reproductive health field focuses on service delivery, individual patients, making sure their needs are met in a culturally competent, safe, and effective and patient-centered way. We are also in partnership, though, with the reproductive rights field, also known as the pro-choice movement, because they're the ones fighting for the constitutional right to have access to evidence-based sex education, birth control, and abortion remain safe and legal and accessible. And then we see reproductive justice as a human rights-based organizing framework. And I'll be talking about what human rights are briefly as I go later into this presentation. We believe that we need to bring into the reproductive health rights and justice movement people who do not see themselves as activists working on reproductive issues. For example, people working on school safety or gun control or transportation issues or tax fairness issues and those kinds of things, because all of those other concerns, as I spoke earlier, are implicated when a person is deciding whether or not to continue a pregnancy or even engage in the struggle to become pregnant. I coined the term reprocide about 20 years ago, talking about the ideologies that seek to control reproduction through the discredited pseudoscience of eugenics. And for those of you unfamiliar with that term, eugenics was a term created by Francis Galton, who was a cousin to Charles Darwin in 1883, basically claiming that human beings could be bred to become better human beings. The false application of the theory of evolution to humanity, basically. And so starting in the early 20th century, the United States embraced this theory of eugenics and started having better baby contests for white families, claiming that it was middle and upper class white people who had an obligation to produce better Americans, while everybody else, and particularly not only people of color like Native Americans and Black people and Latinos and Asian Americans, were exposed to negative eugenics, trying to decrease the number of children that those populations had. But it also affected people who were not middle and upper class white, because of course the Supreme Court ruled in 1922 that it was legal for a state to sterilize a poor white woman named Carrie Buck because they didn't think that she was mentally competent, when in fact Carrie Buck was a domestic worker who had been raped by her boss's son And because she became pregnant through that rape, they deemed that pregnancy as sufficient proof that she was mentally unfit in order to continue to have her reproductive options protected. So they made it legal, in other words, to impose sterilization on people with the support and ratification of the Supreme Court. So in the past, we experienced forced breeding of white women, we feel, sterilization abuse against everybody else. Native Americans were hoped to reproductively disappear and experience genocide. Of course, segregation, restrictive immigration, forced abortions were imposed if a woman who was pregnant, and this continues to this day, is in custody of the government, of the state. Sometimes abortions are imposed upon these vulnerable women simply because they may have become pregnant through the sexual abuse of prison guards, or the authorities don't want to deal with an inconvenient baby, these kinds of things. And of course, the practices of infanticide and the promotion of dangerous contraceptives. And I want to say a word about dangerous contraceptives here. There's no such thing, as you well know, as a 100% effective contraception. All have their risks, all have their promises. But what we argue against is that the person making the calculation about what risk they want to expose themselves to should always be the patient. And instead, since we have the remnants of eugenical thinking in our society, sometimes others other than the patient think that they know what contraceptives that the patient should be using. And that's when the patients are not determining what risks they want to expose themselves to, but sometimes the providers are, or the social context is, when governments only allow one form of contraceptive and not another, for example. And then, of course, some methods of contraceptive don't fit the environment in which they are placed. For example, although it's proven that barrier methods of contraception are effective, there are many environments where barrier methods simply are not an option for women, particularly if those methods require potable water or partner consent, for example. In the present, we're dealing with the past methods plus the issue of sex selection, embryo screening, selective abortions, gamete donor selection, family eugenics, and then non-biological issues, as I spoke about, like tax policies. And I can anticipate in the future that we're going to deal with all of those past practices, plus an increase in pre-implantation diagnosis and screening. The prospect of reproductive cloning is not that far, and is certainly not hard, for at least for me, to imagine that when we get to inheritable genetic modifications and genetic designer babies, that there's not going to be a really large market for more Black and brown babies, that we really are seeing, are still going to be dealing with the increasing commodification of white babies. So I spoke earlier about the reproductive justice standards. Reproductive justice is not a race-based framework. Just because it was created by Black women does not mean it only applies and can be used by Black women. It's a framework based on intersectionality. Intersectionality is a theory that was created by Kimberly Crenshaw, a law professor who talked about how Black women in the 1980s, when she created it, how Black women were vulnerable to both race and gender harm. And she did this as a law professor because our legal system cannot account for multiple vulnerabilities at the same time. Our law deals with either race discrimination or gender discrimination, not if you occupy the intersection of race and gender. A lot of people misuse intersectionality to think of it as a statement of identities, like I'm a Scottish bagpiper or something like that. It is not a statement of identities, it's a statement of vulnerabilities. And we have to understand what you're vulnerable to in order to attend to them. And it's also based on the human rights framework. And because it is, we center the most vulnerable people in our lives. That doesn't mean everyone's not included, but it's kind of like going to the eye doctor and the doctor prescribes the lenses that are right for your eyes. That doesn't mean that all the other lenses are wrong. They're just not yours. But when we center the most vulnerable people in the lens, then we can pretty much assure that we will also be able to take care of less vulnerable people. And reproductive justice is a transnational framework. In other words, our local conditions are often affected and have a relationship to what's happening globally. For example, imagine that you can afford a shirt at Walmart that's cheaply made in the global South. Well, our advantages are often the result of disadvantages of people in other countries. And so we really always insist that you understand the symbiosis between what's happening locally and what's happening internationally. And it links individuals to those structures of inequality. Because imagine that a woman presents in your clinics who lacks citizenship documentation, then that's going to affect her willingness to subject herself to deportation when she shows up for a prenatal visit, for example. Or if she lacks adequate transportation to get to a doctor's appointment, that's going to affect whether or not, in our language, she's a good contraceptor or not. And so if you fail to account for these structures of inequality, you're failing not only to see the entire picture, but you're also not upholding the standards of reproductive justice. And this requires addressing our implicit biases and our cultural assumptions about people, because we have a tendency in our society to make snap judgments about people without considering the entire context in which they're embedded and what's going on in their lives. And to address these human rights violations that we're concerned about, we have to build power. And that means that we have to stop calling each other out and bitterly criticizing each other, but instead figure out how to work better together and not insist on political purity and perfect unity in order to work together, because we have to build the power of many different people with many different ideas and thoughts in order to achieve reproductive justice. And the reproductive justice framework, because it's a human rights framework, it includes everyone. And so we believe that sexual freedom and autonomy to determine one's sexuality and gender identity are key to reproductive justice, both for individuals and communities. And you can't call it reproductive justice if you're not fighting white supremacy and population control. And any analysis of global reproductive politics that doesn't include deconstructing white supremacy as an ideology, addressing the massive faults of neoliberal capitalism, such as have been revealed by the pandemic, and imperialism, our belief that we have the right to go around the world and use our military to take whatever we need, will not be understood to be reproductive justice. And of course, because it's an organizing framework, we must work with other social justice movements to build this new human rights movement for our lives and our family. And as I said, the ability of any person to determine what happens to their body is directly related to what's happening in their community. If they have bad transportation, inadequate housing, toxic water, a food desert, all of these other things. If these are not addressed in their communities, then they inevitably lead to poor reproductive health outcomes. And governments have long known that controlling people's bodies is the way to control entire communities with population control and eugenics logics. And so human rights protections will always determine whether or not a person is able to exercise their free will and be free from violence and coercion. And we offer these new theories and strategies and practices as a way of building the reproductive justice. That's what RJW means, wing of the human rights movement. We see ourselves as part of a larger human rights movement. Obviously, as a feminist, I am part of the women's rights wing of the human rights movement, but I'm disabled, so I'm also part of the disability rights wing of the human rights movement. But I care about fighting racism, so I'm part of the anti-bigotry wing of the human rights movement and economic justice, etc. I don't have enough space on this slide to put all the arrows of the things we should be concerned about. But what I want this depiction to represent is that we have to learn how to do our work fighting for human rights in a way that doesn't violate the human rights of our partners in the movement. In other words, I can't fight against racism in a homophobic way or fight against transphobia in a misogynist way or fight for environmental justice in a way that violates the rights of indigenous people, on and on and on. And so if we recognize that we're all part of the same human rights movement with different roles and different things that we focus on, then I think we'll work much more effectively together. And so since I'm mentioning human rights, I want to go briefly over the 8 categories of human rights that I'm referring to. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was written by the United Nations in 1948, based on a committee chaired by former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. And they wrote the UDHR after World War II because they recognized that the world lacked a global agreement on how human beings should be treated, regardless of what country they were in, regardless of their age, their gender, any of their identity markers. And the reason they felt compelled to do this was because the genocide that Nazi Germany perpetrated, primarily targeting Jewish people, while it was immoral, it was not illegal according to German laws. The same way that the immorality of slavery was practiced in the United States. It was not illegal, but it was immoral, as well as the genocide against Native Americans. And so the world community after World War II said, wait a moment, we are going to create some standards, some norms, some treaties and conventions and covenants that determine how human beings should be treated regardless of their geography or their identity. So the category we're most familiar with is civil rights, the right not to be discriminated in a society, the rights of equality. Those, we've had a civil rights movement, so those are the rights we are most familiar with. Political rights are the limited human rights that are generally taught in our school system because they emanate and were based upon the US Bill of Rights. So that talks about voting rights, speech rights, assembly rights, and I don't even have to tell you about the attacks on voting rights and free speech and stuff that are taking place right now, because this ain't that presentation. But obviously, we've even got a long way to go to protect people's political human rights, not to mention freedom from discrimination under civil rights. Economic human rights, the right to a living wage, workers' rights protection, safe working conditions, etc. We're in major fights around there. There's the Fight for 15 movement, for example, and all these restaurant and fast food employers complaining about they can't find enough workers as if workers are lazy. not recognizing that people are going to make the rational choice not to work for wages that don't support them and their families. Social human rights are those human rights born out of our human needs, our right to health care, food, shelter, education, and welfare. They are not special rights. They are the rights people need based on their needs. And a good way to understand social human rights is that if you accept that every child has a right to an education, for example, then maybe you can also envision that a blind child might need her books in Braille. She does not have special rights. She has special vulnerabilities. Remember intersectionality? Special needs that have to be attended to so that she can enjoy the same human rights as sighted children. Cultural human rights are things like freedom of religion. No one can tell you what religion you should be, but freedom from religion is also a cultural human right. So we have the human right not to have other people's religious views imposed upon our bodies. But whenever you serve a client in a language other than English, you're also supporting their human rights of language. And when you accept that people have the right largely to dress like they want to, so I have to throw a side eye at some choices people make, that is also their human rights. Environmental human rights, our right to clean air and non-genetically modified food without our knowledge and no toxic neighborhoods. Developmental rights are a little harder to explain, but the global south, as we call it now, used to be called the developing world, and they began to demand the right to control their own natural resources. And nearly every war the United States has prosecuted or persecuted or whatever word that is since World War II has been a fight over developmental human rights because we can't seem to explain how our oil keeps getting under other people's sand. And then sexual human rights were those rights demanded by the women's movement starting in the 1970s to decide if and when we'll have children, the right to marry, of course, same sex rights, trans rights, right to birth control, abortion, and contraceptions are part of sexual human rights. I don't want to portray these human rights categories as finite, as if they're over, because I think a ninth category is quickly emerging into pertinence, and that is digital human rights. The right to not only participate in what used to be called the information superhighway, but our rights to privacy under digital human rights and our participation in this advanced technology. And I just want to lift up the Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights so that you can read it in its entirety. Everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care. And medical care is a human right. And the necessary social services and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control. And it goes further to say that motherhood and childhood are entitled to special care and assistance because all children, whether born in and out of wedlock, shall enjoy the same social protection. So since I'm at the end of my time, I'm just going to close with a couple of more PowerPoints because I want to talk about the importance of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide as part of the human rights framework, what's called the International Bill of Rights. It is a human rights violation to deliberately inflict on a group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. And if you is a human rights violation and a crime of genocide to impose measures intended to prevent births within a group if that is done without the consent of the members of that group and forcibly transferring children from one group to another is also an act of genocide, as many indigenous people have gone through, and the abuses currently in our foster care system. So when we talk about population control, we talk about it threatens communities of color while inflating the value of white communities. And it uses these racist, sexist, transphobic, homophobic, and xenophobic stereotypes to do so. And it limits reproductive freedoms and self-determination for everyone. And right now we have a lot of new language wrapping itself around the ideas of population control. Sometimes it sounds very feminist to talk about population stabilization or population justice, but in fact, it's just new language cloaking very toxic and noxious ideas from the past. So we have to stop resurrecting this eugenical thinking that attempts to manipulate people and always connect us disparate public policies that are targeted to manipulate populations. And so we've got to reframe and broaden the definition of population control, reaffirm our values, counter the anti-immigrant movement, and educate people about white supremacy and neo-fascism. Have popular education so that people understand the connections that I'm talking about. Stop isolating women's rights from other human rights issues by linking to other movements and exposing how eugenics can be disguised and really provide a cover for white supremacist thinking. Resist the co-optation of our feminist and conservationist values, you know, and move forward into our future. So I'm going to stop the screen share. Sorry, I went a few minutes over, and see if there's any questions in the Q&A for me. And thank you all for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Loretta. We have learned so much and we have a lot to think about. If people would like to ask a couple questions of Loretta, you could type them in the chat and I will read some out loud. We're getting a lot of thanks in the chat. More thanks. Everyone is very pleased with your presentation. Thank you so much, Loretta.
If you'd like, I can send you a copy of this PowerPoint.
That would be wonderful. Everyone who's attending today will have access to a shared Google Drive. And in that Google Drive, we will share a PDF of slides. We have a question about if you could say how you see reproductive justice as critical in this moment regarding the Texas and Mississippi abortion laws.
Well, actually, I think reproductive justice can be used in several ways. First of all, it reframes the debate, because instead of just talking about when life begins and all of that, why don't we define the people as human rights violators? Because that's essentially what they are doing. They're not just expressing their contempt for women, they're expressing their contempt for people's human rights. And it's really important because very few people, even the most bizarre of them, want to be defined as human rights violators. Where, you can debate on when life begins and what role does Texas legislature and these vigilantes are, but to arm human rights violators and as vigilantes, I think helps to reframe the debate. Secondly, while we conduct the fight in the legislatures and in the court, the women's movement is not going back to pre-1973. We're going to do everything in our power to make sure women don't die, whether that involves smuggling in and giving them access to abortion pills, starting underground railroads to other states so that people can access services. As a matter of fact, I did a presentation to the Massachusetts Abortion Fund. I don't think I got its name right, and warned them that they need to be prepared for abortion tourists, people coming to states for access. So they're going to have to beef up their services, because that's what people did before Roe, go to the states where they could access services if they had the means to do it. And fortunately, we have hundreds of abortion funds around the country, which shouldn't have to exist because people should be able to get it locally. But still, we're prepared to do that. And then too many of us know the technology now. I mean, we know how to do DNCs, and like the Jane Collective pre-row, we're going to have hundreds of Jane Collectives in the affected states so that people don't die. And we're preparing our legal teams to defend us when we break the law in the service of our women. So we can't, the coat hanger imagery doesn't even work anymore because we're not back in the 1970s. This is the 21st century. And I'm so sorry people are still trying to drag us back into the 19th, but we're not going to take it laying down, pun intended.
Thank you so much for that answer. I would love to elevate one more question before we move on to the next presentation. We have a question. A lot of people on this call today are healthcare service providers. Do you have any suggestions for them about how they can get involved to support the reproductive justice movement or as advocates? And where do you see that unique role for clinicians?
I've been asked to give a lot of presentations to nursing and medical schools, and they're always surprised at where I start with teaching them about reproductive justice and human rights, because the strongest critique I offer isn't how they deliver services, but how they train their people. Because most medical training programs violate the human rights of the students. And then they expect them to suddenly remantle themselves with human rights once they graduate and finish their residencies and stuff like that. Well, if you normalize dehumanization of the students, you actually have normalized dehumanization of the patients. And so they don't like the fact that I go so far upstream when I'm talking about this isn't something you just figure out once a patient is in front of you. This is something you have to calibrate in how you prepare people to serve patients. And if you abuse people in their training, guess what? You've normalized abuse in their practices. And so they don't like hearing that lesson. I think they just want a tame Negro to tell them how to be culturally competent. But in fact, I'm like, we are rethinking everything called medical education in our society using reproductive justice standards. Sorry if it's an inconvenient truth, but we feel compelled to tell it.
Thank you so much for that. There are more questions coming in the chat, but because of time, we are going to move on to the next presentation. However, what we are doing today with leftover questions, we will try to see if we can get some responses from the various speakers and then share them again in the Google Drive, which we will let you know when it is up. So
Can I say one more thing?
Oh, yes, please.
I teach an online class called Calling In the Calling Out Culture that includes a lot of this stuff for $5 a lesson every Tuesday night from 7 to 9. And we've got 4 more classes to go, so you can go to my website and get that. So if you want more of this kind of analysis for $5, you can get it at lorettajross.com.
Thank you so much for that plug. I'm sure we'll have many people go check it out. Thank you so much for joining us today. It has been a true pleasure to have you.